Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Paul Hallas. Paul is a highly experienced, energy-focused, non-executive director with many years' experience in the energy sector. Paul, would you like to add anything to your introduction, please?
Yeah, I guess, I'm one of those people, side characters or whatever, who sort of finds the energy sector endlessly fascinating. I've worked in and around the business for longer than you care to remember, as you can probably see from the color of my hair. But there's so much going on. I'm still fascinated by energy and everything that goes with it. And I think part of that is just this kind of constant change, new challenges. We'll talk about those in a minute. So in terms of my career, obviously most of the time, like everybody else, I spent it in employment with companies in the sector, and also partly in consulting. And then, as you said at the beginning, I sort of left full-time employment. I'm at that sort of tail end of my career and now do what my wife calls bits and pieces, and some people call a portfolio. So yeah, non-exec directorships is part of that, and I really enjoy that opportunity in a kind of non-executive role, just to add value to a range of different organisations. I found the last few years still very, very interesting and still rewarding. So I'm going strong and hope I'll continue for a few years yet.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. So how did you get started off in the energy sector then?
Yeah, no, that was an interesting one, and as often happens, sort of a little bit of happenstance. So I've actually got an economics background when I was at uni, and then I went and worked in Africa for 2 years, which was a great first job. I mean, I was so lucky when I look back, and I worked for government civil service, a local civil service in an African country. And the job I ended up doing was helping to try and manage the state's involvement in a whole load of public enterprises, some of which were doing okay, a lot of which were not. So it was a kind of a public enterprise reform thing. And then when I came back to the UK, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I went and did a master's for a year. And then when I applied for jobs, it was the days when we still had, nationalized industries in this country. And I was looking around for opportunities, and one came up in British Gas, as it was at the time. I found the interview interesting. I found the company interesting. I got on really well with the guy who turned out to be my future boss, and just went from there. So I don't know whether some young people have got a much more sort of thought out plan than I did at that time, but I just went from one thing to another. I knew I wanted to kind of work back in the UK, and I just kind of built on the experience I had with public enterprises and thought it'd be good to work for a nationalized industry and see it from the other side of the fence, so to speak. And I just landed in energy, and I haven't wanted to leave it ever since.
I think a lot of people have said that to me, that they get into the energy sector by accident. Do you think that it's still quite easy to do that? Do you think that you're better off to have like a 5-year plan about where you want to go, or should you just really let your career take its own direction?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think it is helpful to have a bit of a plan, and these days it's probably a bit more structured. One of my I can relate to that because one of my daughters works in the energy industry. I never thought I'd be able to say that, but anyway, she does. And that's another thing, by the way. There's a lot more opportunities for women these days than there were when back in the early 80s. And so there is that opportunity to do summer placements and then get on grad schemes, and so I think it is perhaps easier to do it in a slightly more structured way. anybody who's a student, I'd encourage them to try and find a kind of sensible placement, something they're really interested in, if they can find it at the end of their kind of second university year. And you'll either like it or you don't. But if in any case, it's a learning experience, and it sets you up quite well to apply for grad schemes when you graduate. And what I've noticed is that people on company grad schemes in energy these days, I mean, obviously there are sort of more technical areas, that's for engineers and so on, but I mean, in terms of the general grad schemes, you get people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sort of different degrees. And I think just having some evidence of quantitative skills, so there's quite a lot of people from science and engineering backgrounds go on to kind of be graduate analysts or whatever it is. And I think there's perhaps it helps to be in the right place to start with, but I mean, I think there's a lot more kind of well-structured opportunities. And again, one of the virtues of a grad scheme is normally they're 2 years, aren't they? And then it just gives people a bit of breathing space to decide what is it they like doing, what is it they don't like doing, how do they want to sort of see their career develop from that starting point. So it's a great platform, and I think I see, not just from my daughter, but other people I know have been through a grad scheme. I see it's worked out well for them, and you can go off in different directions after that. But it's just a great starting point. It helps you to kind of think about your career perhaps in a bit more kind of a planned way or a structured way than I ever did when I was that age.
Okay. Excellent advice, actually. Did you have a mentor during your career? And if so, what stage of your career did you have?
Again, I was quite lucky. I guess the nearest thing I had to a mentor was my first boss at British Gas as it was then. He went on to be quite senior, so he was executive director of Centrica when Centrica was founded. When was that? 1997, if I remember correctly. So, that was quite a lot of years later. And again, it was slightly kind of happenstance. I mean, I got to a point, I'm trying to think how old I was, maybe kind of early, about 30 or so in what was British Gas and nationalised industry at the time. And it was a pretty sort of rigid organization in some ways. It was kind of difficult to kind of move around and get different kinds of experience. And so then I decided to kind of quit the company, and I went off and worked in consulting for quite a while. So I worked for the consulting arm of one of the big accounting firms at the time. If you'd have asked me, and I probably said I was going to do that for 3 years, and I ended up being there for, trying to think now, but I mean, I think I ended up being there for 7 years, and I guess I could have stayed in consulting, but then I guess I got to a kind of crossroads. I was saying, do I want to kind of remain in consulting and just kind of make my way as a kind of advisor for the rest of my career, or do I want to get involved back in the industry and actually sort of pull a few levers directly? And it's a matter of personal preference. My personal preference was actually to get back into the industry, which I did in 1994. And funny enough, I was recruited by the same guy that had recruited me as a young man in 1982. So, the mentor relationship was kind of reestablished many years later. And I guess if I look back and somebody said, nobody's a perfect individual, but if you look back and said, what is your picture of a kind of ideal boss? I guess he was the closest, and I thought he was always a great guy to work for and very helpful. So he was probably it was a kind of intermittent thing, but he was the nearest thing to a mentor, and I think that is a very valuable thing if you can establish a relationship with somebody who can give you a bit of guidance and again, somebody who's kind of both sympathetic, but also able to sort of stand back and think what's best for you, if you know what I mean. So there's lots of people can give you slightly self-serving advice, but the best mentors are those who can kind of almost stand in your shoes and see it from your point of view.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually. I did see when I was looking at your profile that you do work as a non executive director in the energy retail. I just wondered what that was.
Yeah, so yeah, these are for those people who haven't got a sort of in-depth, energy industry background. We've got these various kind of industry codes. I mean, it's not quite legislation. It's the kind of next level down. These are the kind of rules and regulations by which the industry does its business. And there's various ones in natural gas. We all grew up with what was called the network code, and then became the unified network code later on electricity. There's balancing and settlement code, for example, on the wholesale side. And then in the retail space, there were kind of multiple industry codes, all run by slightly different bodies. And then a decision was taken. I think, if I remember correctly, it was a Competition and Market Authority recommendation, not quite 10 years ago, but maybe it was 2016, that said, look, we've got to do something about this. Is a bit of a mess. And, the retail energy industry was moving to being one in which people were involved in both gas and electricity, but actually the code structures were still kind of separate. It was all a bit piecemeal. So effectively, the Retail Energy Code Company, where I'm the NED, I probably said to you before when we were chatting, it was like a forerunner of a new code model. And it was kind of effectively merging a series of separate retail energy codes that had pre-existed. And I mean, I guess there's also been a change in the way the industries runs itself. I mean, there's a slightly more kind of strategic view of how the code ought to be changed, facilitate competition, efficiency, consumer interests, or whatever it might be. Whereas, previous model was more kind of industry self-managed. And yeah, that had some advantages, but people used to say, yeah, but we're not very good at kind of implementing change. It was all very kind of gradual, incremental. So I think Retail Energy Code Company was sort of a response to that, and say, actually, we need a new way of approaching this with a single organization, a single code, and a slightly more kind of strategic approach to the way we manage change. I mean, so far, I think it's, I'm biased, aren't I? But I mean, I think so far it's been working quite well. I mean, I don't know how whether you know how these code bodies work, but they're kind of not for profit and effectively paid for by the industry. So, we've still got, I mean, our key stakeholders include not only, Ofgem as the national energy regulator, but also all the, suppliers and network companies who effectively pay for the cost of what we do. So, the way we engage with those stakeholders and making sure, everybody's broadly happy with the direction of change, that's an important part of what we're about.
That sounds amazing, actually. It does sound really amazing and very interesting. It must be a very interesting role that you have there. So
yeah, I think so. And what I mean, I've got that luxury at this stage of my life of being able to, the portfolio stage, to have a bit of diversity. So in the kind of things I've gotten involved in, whether as a non-exec director or as a kind of, unremunerated director in community energy, or as a consultant. I mean, I'm just one of those people that really likes quite a lot of variety. And maybe I should have said that as well. In terms of the work that I've done over my career, I ended up working for the same company for a long time, which I never thought I would. And part of the reason for that is that I was fortunate to be able to sort of, fill roles in a number of different places and different types of stuff. So some M&A, some business development, some strategy, some commercial contracts, some regulatory stuff. And again, look back and think I was very fortunate just to have that, variety of challenges in my executive career. And I think these days, probably young people probably move around more than I ever did anyway, and good luck to them. One of the reasons probably why I didn't move around so much was because I just had that opportunity within a single group to do, a wide variety of different jobs, and that kept me kind of motivated and engaged. So but just touching on something there, which I think is important. I mean, I think for young people, I mean, it's rare that people would sort of expect a career with the same company that goes for 10, 15, 20 years in the way that maybe was the case, when I started off in the industry. And, with your oil and gas background, you probably know people like that as well, who were sort of, 20 years with BP or 15 years with Shell or whatever. And, it still happens. I think it's less common these days. And again, it's probably quite a good thing that young people have generally got opportunities to kind of move around more than I ever did.
Okay, yeah, I do agree with that. I think the days of spending 20 years with one company is maybe not on its way out, maybe. I would
Yeah,
think so.
I think that might be certainly a
Yeah.
lot less common than it used to be.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too, actually. So you were saying previously that you had a lot of challenges in the energy sector. What challenges have you faced?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, many and various over the years, but I kind of, I suppose, I think I said that I started off with British Gas, and one of so obviously one of the things that happened between the first time I worked for them and the second time I worked for them was the whole thing was privatized and was open to competition and all those sort of things. So I talked about my kind of endless fascination with the energy sector, and a part of it is just if I look back, the sheer quantum of change that has taken place over a series of decades. And if I think that I mean, British Gas still exists, which some companies have kind of gone by the wayside. But I mean, the British Gas that exists today and the British Gas that I joined in the early 1980s are two completely different animals. So you can imagine the amount of culture change, organizational change, changing business challenges that went with all that. One of the kind of standout things for me when I finished in consulting and when I rejoined the industry, one of the first things we were doing was actually working with the government and the regulator, sort of paving the way for competition in the domestic gas market. I mean, I know it sounds like old history now, but at the time, setting all that up was a massive challenge for everybody concerned. So I was closely involved with that at the time, and that was a really interesting thing. And I guess the couple of other examples, there was again over my working lifetime, the UK has gone from being pretty much self-reliant in natural gas. We used to import a bit from Norway, but the vast majority of natural gas came from our own fields, and we thought of the UK as being almost a kind of self-contained market. Wasn't quite, but now it's completely different, isn't it? I mean, we you can just see from what's happened over the past few years that we're just part of a global market, and the energy price that consumers pay in this country is often influenced by things that are taking place in the US or China or wherever. So we've had that transition from being a kind of a national market to a global market, and that's massive. So that was again one of the things I was a little bit involved with. There was again slightly ancient history now, but the first gas pipeline that was built between Britain on the one hand and the continent on the other, and then that's when we suddenly realised actually we're not an island after all. And I was involved in trying to at that time negotiate gas export contracts with continental European customers. So again, that was another quite big change in the market we were operating in. And then, I mean, later on, the whole kind of European energy industry has gone from a set of slightly kind of unrelated national organizations, sometimes monopolies, to one which is a kind of a genuinely sort of pan-European market, so that companies that are based in, I don't know, France or Germany or Spain or wherever are present in the UK market in a way that never used to exist in the 80s and the 90s. So again, that internationalization has been a massive thing. And one thing I got involved with, which was again interesting at the time, fascinating, was business development, M&A, Centrica trying to kind of establish a footprint on the continent, just as same way as the continental energy companies were sort of investing in the UK. So, again, so if I just look back over my career, some of the, and that's probably a kind of a general lesson, isn't it? Some of the things I got involved with, I could never have imagined as a young man, because, we're all laying in the future, and, nobody was kind of quite predicting that level of change. But that's, my sense is that, change is a constant. And, that is part of what, kind of keeps us on our toes, but also keeps us, continuing to be enthusiastic and engaged and motivated. I hope that I respond quite well to change, and I've certainly seen a lot of changes in 40 years.
I'm pretty sure that you have seen a lot of changes. What is the biggest change that you've seen in the energy sector?
Well, I've talked about a few of them, but maybe let's bring it up to, because young people probably don't want to listen to ancient history too much. But if I talk about the things that are going on now, when I was at Centrica, we always used to talk about the 3 Ds, which are quite a sensible way of thinking about it. So one of them is data and digitalization. If I think about the kind of the way that the amount of data now that's knocking around, and the way we use data, and now we're sort of talking about the promise of AI and all these type of things. Again, that's been a massive change from some of the sort of clunky IT systems we remember from like 15, 20 years ago, and it's still ongoing. So I think that's shaping the industry, and it's allowing us to do stuff today which again was unthinkable sort of 10 or 20 years ago. So I think young people coming to the industry now are coming at a very exciting time. The second big one, I think, is decarbonisation. That is something which, again, 20 years ago was not really on the horizon in the same way it is today. And then I think about stuff I'm involved in and others in the energy industry. So much is now driven by this, agenda of global warming, climate action, trying to be lower carbon, and in these countries, we've got kind of net zero 2050 as a legal target. And I talked about my daughter earlier on. She works in developing solar farms and battery storage and all that. Again, things that were not even on the agenda 20 years ago, and again, massive investments going into new areas, so that the diversity again of what people can get involved in the energy industry is increasing, I think, year on year. So that's the second D. And then I think the third one, which it is developing, but not quite maybe as fast as the others, or maybe not as obviously, but it's the whole kind of decentralization theme. Is that particularly on the electricity side, we got used to when I was a young man, it kind of the energy industry was run by few massive coal and nuclear power stations, and then we got gas-fired power sort of took off in the 1990s. But now, if you think about solar panels, and local projects, and people doing, including retail consumers, people getting involved in low carbon generation for themselves. Again, massive changes. The way that we have to run the system now, particularly the electricity system, is again very, very different from the way that it was 15, 20 years ago. So because of all this kind of decentralization, and at the same time going back to decarbonisation, all the kind of intermittent renewables that people sort of know about. So then again, the way we manage our electricity system is so different, or going to have to be so different from the way it was in the past. So it's just constant change, and maybe you can tell. I mean, when I talk about these things, that I would say I'm still fascinated. I may not be around to see the end point of all of this stuff, but I think for young people joining the industry today, there's just so much going on. Not everybody, but I mean, quite a lot of young people are also motivated by the low carbon thing, and the opportunity to do something to help the country and reduce its carbon footprint. I mean, that is a motivator for quite a lot of young people. Not everybody, but I think a lot. So that's part of the picture as well.
I think so too, actually. So, if you were going to hire a graduate to work in the energy sector, what kind of skills would you be looking for?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, it would depend a little bit what my own role was, and I mean I don't want to sort of give the impression that there aren't still a lot of really good opportunities for engineers. I mean, there are, and if I was if I had a technical engineering background, I'd be looking for probably for that set of skills. But I think I've tried to give the picture already. I mean, there's a lot of it's a lot broader than that these days. So I mean, when I was in the industry, I mean, I was often involved in recruiting and working with graduate analysts. So I mean, it's a mixture of skills and attitudes, isn't it, that you're looking for? So I think in those kind of roles, quantitative skills, and whether that comes from economics or math, physics, or engineering or whatever, doesn't so much matter. But I mean, quantitative skills are always in high demand. I think in the business. I think I've talked to. I'm not not an IT specialist, but I mean, I can see that data and digitalization of everything, is an increasingly important theme. So I think one young man I know is now doing a master's in data science. So he's already worked in the energy industry. He might go back to that, but when he's finished, the world is his oysters, and I think those kind of skills are in massive demand in the energy sector and well beyond it, of course. But and again, these are areas that are, we always had IT people, but it's that kind of the science of manipulating and getting useful and effective results from huge amounts of data, which is, I think, a sign of the modern world. And again, you asked about a retail energy code company. You just see the some of the trends and everything that we're trying to do just requires more data and more effective use of data. Whether it's sort of smart metering or it's now electricity moving to kind of half-hour settlement and all this sort of thing. All of this involves huge amounts of IT, digitalization, data management, data science skills, and never mind the impact of AI and the opportunity to kind of automate processes which we used to kind of think of being essentially human activity. It's a slightly different thing now, but now I've got on the theme. One of the things that has struck me with the decarbonisation and the increasing use of renewable generation. The former colleagues who work in the wholesale energy trading. There's just now, because of when the wind drops or the sun stops shining, you've got to react so quickly. A lot of this is now beyond the power or the speed of the human brain. So actually, there's an increasing amount of short-term electricity trading, which is done by a computer. So again, just an application of AI that I guess 10 years ago was no more than kind of embryonic. So the pace of change in some of these things is just massive. So I'm giving you a very specific answer. So the skills I'm looking for will obviously depend on what my own role is, but there is an increasing kind of variety of different skills called upon in the energy sector, whether it's engineering, whether it's finance, whether it's analytical, whether it's data, digitalization, and so on. I mean, I think there's a kind of a massive range of skills that are required in the industry these days. So, from a young person's point of view, obviously there are opportunities in other sectors as well, but I do think that the energy sector is a pretty exciting prospect right now.
I think so too, actually. So have you had any career disasters?
Okay, that's a great question. I was thinking about one of them the other day, and maybe the high level reflection I'll talk about in a minute. But I mean, one of the high level reflections I have is that sometimes you learn more from your mistakes than you do for your successes. I'm trying to think when this was. This must have been kind of late 90s, and I was doing a sort of corporate strategy planning job, and then somebody said, "Oh, we're setting up a new business within the same group and would like somebody to come along and be the MD of this new business." Oh, well, that sounds very exciting. Of course it would do, wouldn't it? And the first thing I was shown was the business plan, and on the face of it, it looked okay. But in any case, I wasn't told. My job wasn't to interrogate the business plan. My job was to go and implement it. I think it was probably within about a year, that we realized actually the business plan wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. So I'm not sure in the end we were able to save the business, but I'll tell you what, the changes that we made, it's if the business that you're working in, particularly if you're the MD, the business you work for is struggling, the pace at which you move, suddenly, everything is kind of super focused, and you do a load of stuff which, 6 months ago you'd have thought was impossible. So, we create. I mean, our timing was maybe just slightly out. We created, one of the early sort of online internet-based businesses in the late 90s. I think if we'd have done it probably even a year or two earlier, we could probably have sold the business for a decent amount of money. But the timing was just unfortunate. So that if you remember, late 90s was when there was a big kind of value crash around tech businesses and internet-based businesses. Partly because the valuations were completely inflated. But that's one of the things I sort of look back on, and I guess one of the things I draw from that is, if you're asked to run a business, even if it's in the same group, make sure you do your due diligence properly, and try and find out, talk to people who really know, something about this area of business. I mean, I think the background excuse me, the background at the time was that, the company was trying to diversify, and some cases diversified into things that worked really well, but in some cases just pushed the boundaries too far and it went beyond the skill set. So I think, again, that is probably something that, in today's energy industry, people have to be kind of aware of. Do we actually have the core competencies, the insights, the skills that we need to kind of make a success of this particular area of business? And certainly in hindsight, when I look back at probably one of the biggest sort of career failures, I would say actually we didn't, corporately we didn't have, the core competencies and the skills in that area. We just tried to push the boat too far. I think it was the kind of enthusiasm of youth. Somebody said to me, "Oh, would you like to be MD of this new business?" And I thought, fantastic. I think if it had been my older self, I would have said, "Well, wait a minute, let's do a little bit more kind of due diligence on this before we jump into it." That's probably one of the learnings that come with age, I think.
But I think being offered an MD any business, I think that a lot of people would find that exciting, though.
Yeah, it was exciting, and I worked with a great bunch of people. They've all gone on to do great things, I'm sure. But it was just the underlying, the hand that we were dealt, the underlying, business plan just wasn't robust, and we only really discovered that after about a year. By which time we did everything we could to cut costs out and transform the business onto an online proposition and all that sort of thing. But excuse me, at the time it just wasn't. The timing wasn't great, and then by the time we'd done it, the valuation for those kind of businesses had crashed off.
I just think it's just the timing. I think it would have been okay if it had been maybe a few years earlier.
Yeah, and people certainly develop business. It's a bit like the startups now, the timing does matter. I mean, you've got to have the fundamentals on your side, but again, timing is important. If you think about, some of the, clean tech companies, and that's the other thing probably. There's many more young people these days working in smaller companies, startups, and all that sort of thing. Whereas I think, when I was a young man, it was the kind of the recognized names that people tend to go and work for. I think the idea of being your own boss, or being with a small group of people who are their own bosses, is very attractive to some people. But the nature of the thing is that some of those startups will do magnificently well. A lot of them will do just about kind of average, and some will fail, and sometimes fail spectacularly. So it's just for young people who are sort of thinking about that as a career step. I mean, again, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, in the energy space, but it's just a kind of awareness that there's no kind of free lunch. There's not a kind of easy option. It sounds very exciting, and it is, but you've still got to kind of kick the tires fairly hard before you jump in.
Okay, that's really good advice, actually. So I was going to say, what keeps you motivated when things get tough?
That's a number of answers to that. I mean, and I think some of it I've touched on already. So one is as I said, I've continued to find the energy sector, endlessly fascinating, and it's the level of change, which in my working lifetime has been massive. So I still want to go to the next level, and so on when I get involved in stuff. The other one, which is very important, I think, always is people. And again, I'm lucky, I think, at this latter kind of tail end of my career, in the sense that I don't really have to do stuff or work with people that I don't find good to work with. And I think, we talked about mentors earlier on. I think, whatever age you are, whether it's a young person or whether you're older, I mean, I think, a lot of what motivates us and keeps us going is the colleagues that we have. And, so that's very important. And, I think if you're in a tough situation with, people who you really trust and who are, mutually supportive and, and resilient, that makes an awful lot of difference. And I guess the third thing is that is just, your own personality, your own character. We're all kind of, what's the word? We're all prisoners of our own history. I think I said at the beginning, I'm originally from Yorkshire, so we're known to be quite stubborn. So sometimes when things don't go well, I'm right. We're gonna prove them wrong. We're gonna do this anyway. And I think some of if I look back, some of the kind of proudest things or achievements in my career, when people have said, no, that'll never happen, oh, that's all too difficult. And there's one or two things I look back on, we pulled it off. And I didn't do it on my own, but working with others, it's amazing what you can achieve when you get the right people together with the right level of support.
I think so too. I do think so. I think having support of your team around you is very important.
Yeah, I mean, from a number of points of view, isn't it? I mean, it's a kind of a diversity of background, skills, experience, and so on. That's important, but it's also people being supportive in a human sense, and just being good friends and supporting one another, and again, as you were saying, when times get tough, teams can react in a number of different ways. You can have a reaction where everybody says, right, I'm just going to look after myself, and I'll point a finger at the people, I'd like to say it was their fault. Or you can have a group that really pulls together and says, right, together we're going to go get through this, and we're going to overcome the difficulties, and we're going to come out the other side. So I think that's down partly to corporate culture, but it's also down to individuals, and having the right teams in the right place at the right time makes a world of difference.
I think so too, actually. I do think so too. So I was going to ask you, do you have any advice for any young graduates, budding graduates wanting to enter into the energy sector?
You may be. I mean, I'm just hesitating because it depends a little bit how they want to approach it. So, I mean, what one of the things we've talked about is the kind of structure that goes with summer placements, grad schemes, and so on. And I think that's still, I think, a great starting point. And because a typical grad scheme would be, if you can get on one, is that normally you'll do several different jobs over a period of 2 years, and you. In that period of time, you end up learning more about the industry, but also more about yourself. which is important. You know, what is that I enjoy? What motivates me? What is that I don't really like doing? What do I find kind of boring or uninspiring? So I think that's an important part of it. We've talked a little bit about startups and so on. I think if you've got the right temperament, that can be quite exciting. I guess I'd say to people, probably don't jump into that too soon. I mean, it's the sort of thing that, and there are counter examples. There are people who've gone more or less straight out of university and ended up running a startup, and some of them have gone to great things. But I think on the law of averages, it's something that I'd say actually you probably do better if you've got a little bit of experience behind you before you sort of jump into a startup, because it can be a very tough place to be, and you perhaps just need a little bit more and a nous and experience to navigate your way through that and decide whether it's right for you in the first place. And then I mean, I guess the other thing, I mean, I've spent time in consulting. I mean, that's still kind of quite attractive to people, I think. Again, depends entirely on your personality. I mean, my experience, I would say, in consulting, you see an awful lot. So I mean, when I spent, let's say, 7 years with a reasonably large kind of consulting management consulting firm in the energy sector, and got involved in a whole bunch of things that I would never have got involved in if I'd stayed in a single company. So from that point of view, it was great experience. Worked with a lot of very bright people, as you might imagine. The other side of the coin is that, and again, it's probably just my personality, but I mean, I felt at the end of the day that did I want to be kind of always the advisor and never the lead? And in the end, I took the decision that I want to go back in. It's a long time ago now, but I want to go back in the industry. So I mean, I stopped being a consultant in the mid-90s and went back to work in the industry. So I still say it's if you've got the temperament and the aptitude and the skills for it, probably still quite a good thing to do for a few years, and then you'll decide whether you want to make that your kind of long-term career or not. So I mean, yeah, I could go on all day, but I mean, I think those are a few sort of reflections based on my own experience. But everybody is different. Everybody kind of make their own way in the world at the end of the day.
I think so too, actually. I think so too. So I'm going to ask you maybe one final question. If you could turn back time, would you change anything? Well, I gave. I wouldn't change a lot. I think. I feel as if as if I've been very fortunate, and I feel I've had a fascinating career in and around the energy business. Still want to do it, as you can see, and with the voluntary stuff I do in community energy, that's just an opportunity to kind of use some of that skills and experience and give something back to local communities and so on. So again, that's important for me. And would I change stuff? Not a lot, I think. Maybe a couple of thoughts. I mean, we talked about the business catastrophe of the late kind of 90s. I would have approached that differently if I'd known what I know now. But I mean, it's easy to say, isn't it? I mean, we all have the opportunity to learn from other people's mistakes, but generally we've got to make the mistakes ourselves to really learn the lessons, I think, sometimes. And when I talk to people who are in the kind of startups, they are often very resilient people who say, well, unless you failed a few times, you're never going to be a great success. So, and the other one, would I maybe in hindsight, I would have thought about kind of moving around the industry a bit more than I did. I worked for the same company for a long period of time, and I think partly because I had that tremendous variety of different roles, which kept me kind of very enthusiastic and engaged. I think that young people these days would probably move around more often. So I think the advice would be even if you're reasonably happy in your role, just keep your eyes and ears open, because you never know opportunities are going to come along for you, and if you don't look, you probably will never see them. I think that's amazing advice, actually. That is amazing advice. So That's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Paul for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening and see you next week.
Michelle, thank you very much. Wishing you a great weekend.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening and see you next week.